Our prince traveled for over 3 years, so that they almost completely forgot about him in town. We heard from Mr. Verkovensky that he'd been all over Europe and also visited Egypt and Jerusalem, that he'd later managed to attach himself to some learned expedition to Iceland and actually to visit that land. We were also told that he had spent a winter attending lectures in a German university. He only wrote to his mother once every 6 months, sometimes even less often, but she didn't seem to resent it. She humbly accepted her relations with her son as they were, although she missed her Nikolai and made up all sorts of daydreams about him. She never complained or shared her dreams with anyone. She had even become somewhat distant with Mr. Verkovensky. She seemed to be making all sorts of secret plans and grew stingier than ever, saving money with even greater zeal and becoming more and more irritated with Mr. Verkovensky's losses at cards. Finally, in April, she received a letter from Paris from her childhood friend Praskovia Drozdov, the general's wife. They hadn't seen each other or corresponded for over 8 years, but now suddenly Mrs. Drozdov wrote that Nikolai had practically become a member of their household, that he had become a very close friend of her only daughter, Liza, and that he intended to accompany them to Verney-Montreux in Switzerland that summer. Despite the fact that in the family of Count K, a very influential personage from Petersburg, he was also received like a son and had almost moved in on the Count in Paris. Mrs. Drozdov's letter was brief and its point obvious, although she drew no conclusions from the above-mentioned facts. It didn't take Mrs. Stavrogin very long to decide what to do, taking along her protégée, Dasha, Shatov's sister. She left for Paris by the middle of April and from there went to Switzerland. In July, she was back by herself. She had left Dasha at the Drozdovs who, she told us, were coming back to Russia by the end of August. The Drozdovs also owned land in our part of the country, but General Drozdov, who was an old friend of Mrs. Stavrogin and a former army colleague of her husband, had found that his duties constantly prevented him from spending any time on his magnificent estate. Then, after the general's death, his disconsolate widow had gone abroad with her daughter and, while there, had decided to take a grape cure at Verney-Montreux during the second half of the summer. After that, she intended to settle in our province permanently. Mrs. Drozdov had a large townhouse that had stood empty and shuttered for many years. She was, in fact, a very wealthy woman. Like her childhood friend Varvara, Praskovia was the daughter of a rich government contractor and had received a big dowry when she married her first husband, Tishin. A retired cavalry captain, he was a gifted and intelligent man and very rich himself. When he died, he left a substantial fortune to his daughter, Liza, who was then only 7. Now she was 22, and a conservative estimate would have put her capital at 200,000 rubles, that is, without counting what would be left to her by her mother, who had no children, by her second husband, Drozdov. Varvara Stavrogin seemed very pleased with her trip. She felt she had reached a satisfactory agreement with her friend Praskovia Drozdov, and as soon as she returned, told Mr. Verkovensky about it. Indeed, she chatted with him as she had not for a long time. "Hooray!" Verkovensky exclaimed, snapping his fingers. He was very enthusiastic, especially since he had been feeling rather despondent during her absence. She had not even said goodbye to him properly, nor had she confided any of her plans to that, quote, "that old woman," end of quote, fearing that his tongue would wag. She had been furious with him at the time because of a larger-than-usual gambling loss that he had just confessed to her. However, while still in Switzerland, she had felt she had been treating him roughly for some time. In fact, her sudden and mysterious departure had torn Mr. Verkovensky's vulnerable heart. And to make things worse, he was suddenly beset with various other problems. First, he was tormented by a financial difficulty of long standing that couldn't possibly be solved without Mrs. Stavrogin's intervention. Then, in May, our nice meek Ivan Osipovich was replaced, and under rather unpleasant circumstances at that. And while Mrs. Stavrogin was still away, the new governor, Andrei Antonovich von Limk, took over. Immediately there was a noticeable change in everyone's attitude toward Mrs. Stavrogin, and naturally toward Mr. Verkovensky as well. At least he noticed some unpleasant and significant indications and was rather subdued by having to face everything alone. He knew from absolutely reliable sources that some of the ladies of our town intended to stop visiting Mrs. Stavrogin. The incumbent first lady, it was said, had a reputation for being very proud and haughty. But at least she was a real aristocrat. Quote, unlike poor old Mrs. Stavrogin, end of quote. Everyone seemed to have heard somehow that the new first lady and Mrs. Stavrogin had already met socially, and had parted on decidedly unfriendly terms, and that the mere mention of Mrs. von Limk's name caused painful symptoms in Mrs. Stavrogin. But now, Mrs. Stavrogin's triumphant air and her scornful indifference to the ladies' opinions of her revived Mr. Verkovensky's faltering spirits, and he immediately became gay and cheerful. He began to describe to her in gloating tones, in which she detected a certain obsequiousness toward herself, the arrival of the new governor in their town. I'm sure, cher ami, that you are already fully aware, he said, in an affected voice, drawing out his vowels, what a Russian administrator is like in general, and particularly a newly baked, we may say, Russian administrator. But I don't suppose you'll grasp the meaning of what might be called administrative passion, or what sort of animal it is. Administrative passion? No, I don't know what that is. Well, vous savez, chez nous, in un mot, if you place some unspeakable non-entity anywhere, say in a wretched railroad ticket office, the poor creature will start looking down on you as though he were Jupiter himself, as long as you want to buy a train ticket. Just pour vous montrer son pouvoir. And that's the type that attains to administrative passion. En un mot, I read about some stupid sexton in one of our churches abroad, mais c'est très curieux, who kicked out of his church, and I mean literally turned out, a very nice English family, des dames charmantes, just before the beginning of the Lenten service. Vous savez ces chants, et les levures de Job, just because, quote, it ain't proper for them foreigners to wander around Russian churches except during proper visiting hours, end of quote. The ladies almost fainted. Well, that sexton was feeling his administrative passion to the full, et il a montré son pouvoir. Make a short story of it if you can, my friend. Mr. von Limk has left on a tour of the province now, en un mot, although he's a Russified German and Russian Orthodox, and even, to be fair, a handsome man still in his 40s. How can you think he's handsome? He has bovine eyes. Yes, very much so, but I must concede to the opinion of our ladies. Keep to the point, please. By the way, since when do you wear red ties? That, just today. And have you been exercising regularly? Do you go for a daily 5-mile walk as the doctor ordered? Not too regularly. I thought so. Even when I was in Switzerland. I knew you wouldn't do it, she said irritably. From now on, you'll walk not 5 miles, but 7 every day. It's incredible the way you've let yourself go. Really unbelievable. You've not simply aged, you've grown quite senile in these past months. I was really struck by the sight of you when I first arrived, despite that red tie of yours. Oh, that tie. What an idea, red. And now tell me about von Limk, if you really have something interesting to say, and please, get it over with, for I'm very tired. En un mot, I was about to tell you that he is one of those men who've suddenly been entrusted with administrative power when they're in their 40s, until which point they've been non-entities cooling their heels. Then, by finding themselves a brand new wife or some other desperate measure, that is, he's out of town now, that is, I wanted to tell you that they've been whispering things in his ear about me, that I'm a kind of perverter of youth, a provincial sower of the seeds of atheism. And so he started making inquiries about me right away. Are you sure of what you're saying? Yes. I've even taken some countermeasures. And when they went to him with talk about how you used to run the province, he dared to answer, quote, nothing of the sort will happen while I'm here. Is that what he said? Yes, nothing of the sort will happen while I'm here. And he said it with that arrogance of his. And by the end of August, we'll have the pleasure of seeing his wife. She's coming straight from Petersburg. No, from abroad. We met there. What? In Paris and in Switzerland. She's related to the Drozdovs. She's related to them? What a wonderful coincidence. I've heard she's terribly ambitious and has very influential connections. Nonsense. Just very ordinary connections. She was a penniless old maid until she was 45. Then she hooked her von Lemke, and now, obviously, she's trying to push him ahead. They're schemers, both of them. They say she's 2 years older than he. 5 years. Her mother wore out the seat of her skirts waiting to be received in my house in Moscow. She kept begging me to invite them to my receptions when the general was alive. And when she came, her daughter would sit all night with a great turquoise bow on her forehead without ever being invited to dance. I'd feel sorry for her, and when 2 o'clock in the morning rolled around and she still didn't have a partner, I'd send her one. She was already 25, but they dressed her in short dresses as though she were a little girl. It was positively awkward to invite them. I can see that bow now. I tell you, no sooner had I arrived than I stumbled upon an intrigue. You know, you've just read Praskovia Drozdov's letter. What could be clearer? And what did I find there? That fool Praskovia, she's always been a fool, looks at me questioningly as if to say, what on earth have you come here for? Can you imagine my surprise? I had a good look around and found that Lemke woman scheming away. And with her, that nephew of old Drozdov, everything was clear. Oh, it took me no more than a blink of an eye to turn the tables on them and get Praskovia Drozdov back on my side. If they want to scheme, I'll show them what scheming is. So, you've succeeded in thwarting their plans. You're a real Bismarck. I didn't have to be a Bismarck to detect falsehood and stupidity when I came across them. The Lemke woman is falsehood, and the Drozdov woman, stupidity. I don't think I've ever met a flabbier woman. She has swollen legs, and on top of that, a kind heart. What is more stupid than a kind-hearted fool? A vicious fool, ma bonne amie. A vicious fool is even more stupid, Mr. Verkovensky dissented bravely. Well, maybe you have a point there. I suppose you remember Liza? Un charmant enfant. Well, she's no longer an enfant. She's a woman. And a woman with plenty of character. She's high-spirited and quick-tempered, and I like the way she stands up to her silly, trusting mother. There was very nearly a real row about that nephew of old Drozdov's. Yes, but he's really not related to Liza, unless he has views on her. You see, he's a young army officer and doesn't talk much, rather a modest young man, in fact. In all fairness, I must say that I don't think he ever approved of the whole intrigue. It was all the Lemke woman's idea. The nephew greatly admires Nikolai, so, of course, everything depends on Liza. Now, when I left, she was on the best terms with Nikolai, and he promised me he'd be back home in November. So it's the limp woman who's intriguing, and Praskovia is just blind. Can you imagine? She suddenly declared to me that all my suspicions were sheer fantasy. So I told her, to her face, that she was a fool. And I'm prepared to repeat it on the day of judgment. If it hadn't been for Nikolai's insistence that I leave things alone for the time being, I wouldn't have left without exposing that lying woman. She was trying to use Nikolai to get on the good side of Count K. She was actually trying to set the son against his mother. But Liza is on our side, and I've reached an agreement with Praskovia. Do you know, by the way, that the limp woman is related to Karmazinov? What? Karmazinov is a relative of Mrs. von Limp? Certainly, a distant relation. You mean the novelist? Well, yes, the writer. What's the matter with you? What if he does regard himself as a great man? The swollen-headed creature. They will arrive here together in the meantime. She's parading him around over there. I understand she intends to organize some kind of literary gatherings here or something of the sort. He's coming here for a month to liquidate the last bit of some property he owned near here. I almost ran across him in Switzerland, without seeking it, believe me. However, I hope that he'll be gracious enough to recognize me when we meet. In the old days, he used to come to the house and write me letters. I wish you dressed a bit better, Stepan. You get more slovenly every day. Oh, the trouble you give me. What book are you reading now? I see. You're the same as ever. Friends, drinking parties, the clubs, cards, and a reputation as an atheist. I don't like that reputation, Stepan. I don't like them referring to you as an atheist, especially not now. I didn't like it before either because it was just empty chatter anyway. I suppose I was bound to say it finally. Ma chère amie, listen to me now. As far as learning goes, of course, I'm nothing but an ignoramus compared to you. But when I was on my way back here from abroad, I kept thinking of you, and I came to one conclusion. What was that? That we, you and I, really aren't the cleverest people on earth, that there are other people cleverer than we are. That's both witty and correct. There are people smarter than we, and they are therefore more likely to be right than we are. Therefore, we may have erred, right? Ma bonne amie. Let's assume I'm mistaken. Don't I still have my eternal, supreme, human right to free thought? So, I have the right not to be a hypocrite and a bigot, even if it makes certain people hate me till they're blue in the face. Et puis, comme on trouve toujours plus de mots que de raison, and since I fully go along with it, what was that? What did you say? I said, on trouve toujours plus de mots que de raison, and since I agree, I'm sure you didn't make that up. You must have borrowed it somewhere. Blaise Pascal said it. I was sure it wasn't you. Why don't you ever say anything briefly and to the point yourself? You always drag everything out. I like his way of putting things much better than yours, when you went on and on about administrative passion. Well, I must say I agree, my dear, but in the first place, I'm no Pascal. And then, we Russians are incapable of saying anything in our native tongue. At least, we haven't said anything thus far. That may not be true at all, but you ought to write down and memorize phrases like that to use in conversation. Ah, Stepan, to think that on my way here, I longed to have a serious talk with you. Cher ami. Now, when all these Lemks and Karmazinovs, oh Lord, how far you've let yourself go. Ah, you make me so unhappy. I want those people to respect you. Because they're not worth your little finger, but look at the way you behave. What can I show them? What will they see? Instead of standing like a living testament to our ideals and setting them an example, you surround yourself with all sorts of scum, acquire repulsive habits, and turn senile. You can't live without wine and cards. You read nothing but Paul de Kock's cheap French novels. You never write a word. And you waste all your time in idle chatter. Tell me, for instance, do you think becoming bosom pals with a disgusting creature like your Laputin is right? Why do you call him mine? And why is he my bosom pal? Mr. Verkovensky protested meekly. Where is he now? Mrs. Stavrogin asked sharply and sternly. He has the utmost respect for you. He's gone to Smolensk to receive a legacy left him by his mother. It looks to me as if all he does is receive money. And what about Shatov? Still the same. Still bad-tempered and still a good man. I can't stand him. He's spiteful and so full of himself. And how is Miss Shatov? You mean Dasha? Why do you ask? She looked at him with curiosity. Well, she's fine. I left her with the Drozdovs, and you know, when I was in Switzerland, I heard things about your son. Bad things. Ah, that's a stupid story. I wanted to tell you about it, my dear. All right, that'll do, Stepan. Leave me in peace. I'm exhausted as it is. We'll have plenty of time to talk things over, especially the bad things. You splutter when you laugh, and that's really a sign of senility, you know. And how strangely you laugh these days. Good God, what a lot of bad habits you've picked up. In your present condition, Karmazinov will never call on you, and that will make them happier than ever. You've finally revealed your true self for everyone to see. But that's enough. Can't you occasionally show me some consideration? At least, and let me rest. Mr. Verkovensky displayed his consideration for her and left. But he left greatly perturbed.